I'd like to welcome everybody back. For our second panel, I realized that this morning I forgot to mention the sponsors for this event. We have received support from Dartmouth's 250th Committee, from the Dickey Center for International Understanding, from the Departments of Classics and of History, and for the work that you will see summarized and presented here, we had funding for curricular innovation from a Leslie Humanities Center grant, and for the special work of my learning fellow, Nataly DeFreitas, we had extended support from the UGAR, the Undergraduate Office for Undergraduate Research. This second panel concerns wars with living memory. Students in War Stories, which was Colt 64 CLST 11, interviewed alumni veterans with a focus on the effects of the wars. World War II veterans, we had 2 respondents, both of which had to express regrets that they couldn't participate, mainly from Korea and Vietnam. The post-Vietnam interviews will not be presented here. That's a work in progress. We asked them, the students were tasked to ask them about their student experience, the atmosphere and the discourses on the campus during the war, their relationships with their professors, with their fellow students, and with the liberal arts curriculum, both before and after their service, their understandings of military service as duty, as service, as, I guess, potential career. And that work is going to be framed, summarized, and presented today for you as panel number 2. The goal of the interview assignment was twofold: to collect historical evidence for what I hope is an upcoming manuscript project on Dartmouth's long history with the military. There was a second desired learning outcome, and that was to create respectful intergenerational dialogue between veterans and students, many of whom had no direct experience in their families of military service and sacrifice. After the Vietnam War era, and Professor and President Wright has said much about this, families no longer have direct experience. So the students were given the opportunity to learn from military veterans. The evidence is the interviews of alumni veterans, and I want to thank them. Jerry Mitchell, the class of 51, Bradley Corrigan, the class of 52, Daniel Boyd, the class of 53, John Baldwin, Dartmouth class of 55, David Pruitt of 61, Tim Brooks, Anthony, Tony Thompson, Rand Beers, Dartmouth class of 64, James Weiskopf, class of 66, Burton Quist, Ron Brown, David Walden, Dartmouth class of 68, John Frondorf, class of 69, James Bullion, class of 78, Robert Charles, class of 82, Richard Utzon, class of 85, Terry Stentz, grad school, class of 89, Joseph Scott, 2000, and Christian Heiss, 2002. Each of those veterans gave their time, some of them skeptically, but in the end, I received glowing thank you notes for the interactions that they had with our students. And so the work that's going to be presented, the presenters, I had marvelous students. Ms. Paula Lenart, Dartmouth class of 20, is an international student. She is an engineering major modified with studio art. The left brain, right brain of the Dartmouth student is remarkable. And she is the center for Dartmouth women's basketball team. She is forceful on the court and successful and on and off. And her work in war stories was exemplary, and I'm delighted she can join us today to present. Vitalia Williams, Dartmouth class of 2022, is part of the 3rd posse cohort at Dartmouth campus. She served in the U.S. Army 2013 to 2018 at the rank of Staff Sergeant. She worked in watercraft logistics operations. You're allowed to ask her what that means. She interviewed a local Dartmouth alum, Jerry Mitchell, and I'm delighted that she will bring his words forward today. Nataly DeFreitas is a senior, an econ and English major, a veteran, and a military spouse. She served in the U.S. Army Reserve and deployed in Afghanistan in 2012 as a PSYOP specialist. She worked as my learning fellow in war stories in 2018. She worked as a junior research fellow, there's UGAR, in spring 2018. And to prepare for this program, I've received further funding, and she's going to continue to work with me, I say looking over at her. And so I hand the program over to her and to them, if you will help me welcome them.
Thank you, Professor Stewart, and thank you everyone for taking the time to come and listen to us speak today. My research focused on Dartmouth student veterans, Dartmouth alumni that served, the conversations and dialogues that went on around war, which played out in large part in the Dartmouth and were available for me to peruse through. I want to thank Professor Stewart for the opportunity to do this research and also to take part in the War Stories course in the fall of 2018. It was a learning experience for me, even as I was facilitating conversations. I learned a lot from the other students, and there's just a lot to learn from the dialogues. And so through the research, I discovered what maybe wasn't apparent to me when I first came to Dartmouth campus, was that Dartmouth has a very deep history with the military and a very strong connection with the military. In War Stories, we talked about discourses that transcend time, and I found that over and over and over again, reading through the Dartmouth, looking through archives in Ronner. And I would like to mention how amazing and helpful the librarians are at the Ronner Library and the amazing resources they have. It was wonderful to work with them. And I also gained a better perspective on what I think I can characterize through my research in the Dartmouth as World War II as a good war. And so I started looking at where Dartmouth was at in 1939. And this is, I think, a neat map drawn by an alum of what Dartmouth's campus looked like. And we can see that there's certain buildings missing, but some of the main characteristics of Dartmouth are definitely there. And there's a little skier in the upper right-hand corner, which I enjoy. So we're looking at a campus that is different from what we would experience today. So published in 1939, the Dartmouth used to have something called the Green Book, which was like a yearbook of sorts for freshmen incoming into Dartmouth. In 1939, they published for the class of 43, this was in the foreword of the Green Book, featuring a picture of Memorial Field, the memorial to World War I. And in it, it has a foreword. And the foreword says, in part, that we're looking to World War II. And the students at Dartmouth were trying to put in context what they were beginning to face with a world war. And they were thinking of the thousands of Dartmouth men who fought for America in the last war and the hope that their college education would not be wasted in battle and their contribution to society could be greater than that. So in the context of the coming war and questions about involvement, other students were questioning it a little bit less. This is from Ronner's Oral History of World War II, from Walker Reed, class of 40, who served in the U.S. Army, who describes what we know today as the Dartmouth bubble. He said, quote, "We were in a shell. I was at least. I don't know why we weren't more conscious of international affairs, probably because it wasn't just of great interest." But although many students were in a bubble, we still have that framework of the question of war and questions of isolationism. And so these are all from the Dartmouth. All of the articles going forward in my presentations are from the Dartmouth. And all of the quotes will be from Dartmouth alums. These all discuss the different pushes towards joining the war. There's articles to the President of the United States printed. There's opinion polls going on with the Dartmouth. And all in all, even though it might be a slight majority, Dartmouth gains a reputation of topping the nation in willingness to actually go to war. In the midst of these conversations about whether or not the United States should enter World War II, Dartmouth is doing a lot administratively to prepare the college for war. And so operating since before we joined World War II is the American Defense Dartmouth Group, which coordinated many war-related functions on campus, including defense instruction. So in fall of 1941, the American Defense Dartmouth Group, which is a group formed by President Hopkins at Dartmouth College, which was comprised of faculty members, they printed that, quote, "We believe the United States should take vigorous action for the destruction of Nazi tyranny. There can be no halfway measures, no compromises. If this means war, then let us enter it." So there was a strong push from the Dartmouth College administration and faculty of going and entering into World War II. The American Defense Dartmouth Group had many purposes. These are some articles talking about the group itself and some of the consequences of the group, which would be defense course enrollment. So the ADDG committee had committees on press and publicity, where they sent information to different news outlets, committee on plans for permanent peace. So not only were they thinking about how can we prepare for this eventuality of war, but how will we find peace afterwards? So it was a lot of advanced planning with the group. They had a committee on radio, a committee on public speaking, where they would send speakers to different military bases to talk to soldiers in the United States Army about the importance of education. And they had a committee on defense instruction, which is this article here, which dealt with war-related courses that would be taught at the college. One of the chairman of this committee, Professor Messer at the time, said that everything in college curriculum has been changed because of the war. By 1941, anticipation of the war and the actions of the American Defense Dartmouth Group brought defense courses to Dartmouth, which also lowered enrollment in other departments. There were 8 new fields of study, 7 new defense courses, and by fall of 1941, Dartmouth's first military course since World War II offered a ski program. The courses were in mathematics for navigation and ballistics, electronic physics, map interpretation, tests and measurement for military personnel, modern war strategy and foreign policy, power politics, and components of democratic thought. And the departments of classic civilization and music department enrollments dropped by about half in favor of these courses. In 1942, physical fitness tests were required at Dartmouth. It became a part of the student life here. In fact, it was taken very seriously, so seriously that students who didn't take it faced suspension. And the other Ivy League colleges followed suit. Princeton, Harvard, and Yale all incorporated some form of mandatory fitness test in preparation for the eventuality of serving in the military. And so the question of war permeates a lot of the campus. We have student polls in the Dartmouth, and even fraternities are holding debates on the topic. In 1941, President Hopkins' convocation address talks about this specifically, in which he advocates joining the war effort. He says, quote, "To ignore the fact that to be without force is to invite war is to ignore all of the lessons of history, and more fatal than lacking force is the lack of will to use it." And so we know that by December, Pearl Harbor happens, and these are the immediate reactions in the Dartmouth, one from December 7th, one from December 8th. And they just were very interesting to me. Not every war has an immediate reaction in the Dartmouth, but because of timing, it was able to respond. And what was incredible to me, and this really moved me, was December 8th, there's already a reaction from a student being published in the Dartmouth. And this kind of gets to me every time I read it. I've got a couple of excerpts from it. And I think they characterize the spirit of what this student was trying to communicate. So this student wrote, "We're at war with Japan. We personally would like to stop there and leave it at that. We would like to stop there because we are 20 years old, because this is the first war we have any memory of which affects us personally, and because when something very big happens and is all around you and inside of you, there's not very much you can say, because if we did say what was inside of us, many people would laugh, good people, maybe." The writer goes on to say, "So what can you say? One fellow, one American guy up here in New Hampshire, 3,000 miles from San Francisco, and another 2,400 miles from Pearl Harbor, and still another 4,750 miles from Manila. One fellow, 20 years old, trying hard to speak for 2,400 other fellows, trying to fit yourself and them and every American, all 130 million of them, into this too big scheme of a world war. And it kind of chokes me up every time I read this because it speaks to something to me that transcends conflicts, time, situations, context, which is, there are certain things about war that are just difficult to put into words, maybe impossible. And the idea of facing the unknown in a context that this writer is trying to describe of the personal, the national, the world, the global, and Dartmouth's campus, and how do you find how to speak about this and think about it, and the difficulty of that is just, it was moving to me. But there were a lot of different reactions. And so this is from Samuel Forman of 46, who ended up serving in the Navy V12, which I will talk about in a little bit. This is also from Ronner's oral history collection on World War II. Forman said, "It was very strange, the early months of the war. We were in a war, but we had no television. There was plenty of censorship. The news was very slow. And there wasn't that much because things were happening far, far away, and life after the original shock seemed eerily normal. So the thought was, well, go on to college, we'll leave our lives, and maybe this war will be over before we know it." And this is something that I see again and again and again through the decades, through the conflicts, is the idea that maybe, just maybe, the conflict will pass me by, but that kind of underlying implication in the writing that the author knows it won't. And so Dartmouth's campus and the students are trying to put into perspective what this means, and they again and again look to World War I for context and to frame it and to learn how to think about it and to anticipate the changes that they might expect. Forman had another quote which I really liked. He said, "And I remember that fall, as the term started, representatives from the various services started showing up on campus and giving presentations. And it was like going to the movies. You went this evening and the Army is telling you how wonderful the Army is and what wonderful chances and opportunities you'll have, and if you only sign up with them, they'll leave you in college, and then when you do go to the Army, you're going to be a 4-star general before you know it, and maybe 1 semester, 2 semesters later, as the war required, all the promises were forgotten, and suddenly dozens of classmates were swept off to boot camp and were in the middle of battle before anybody really knew what had happened." I love this quote. We'd probably be talking about recruiters today, in my opinion, but it changes really quickly, and it goes from the idea, the kind of abstract idea of war, into a very serious reality. And so the college responds in different ways. The college has a relationship with the Navy and brings on the Naval Indoctrinational School around this time, V1 program, a college air unit, the largest one in the country at the time, reacting fairly quickly. This is in 42. The college is so committed to the war effort and to training students and helping and being a part of this war effort that they actually sign an indefinite contract with the Navy. They put no limit on how long the Naval Indoctrinational School could operate at Dartmouth, which to me was really significant to me personally that they would do that. And so the V1 program is an initial Navy program at Dartmouth. It allows students to continue studying college contingent on meeting the requirements, and many students join it, but it'll eventually be replaced by a program called the V12. So things don't stay the way that they were when the war starts. The draft changes, lots of changes happen, and one of them is the low draft. So the draft gets lowered down to, I guess, about 18 years old, and this is one student's reaction to that. They wrote in the Dartmouth in September of 1942, "This, in fact, means every damn one of us. The novelty of facing a call to military service has worn off. It is no longer a wild discovery. It is simply a part of contemporary living." And so, again, we've got that shift from the abstract idea of what war is to a very real reality that they're going to be called up and they're going to go. This naturally has pressures on enrollment. The draft had extreme downward pressures on enrollment in liberal arts colleges around the country. In 1941, our Dartmouth saw the largest, highest enrollment in its history, and by fall of the next year of 1942, the college saw its lowest enrollment in 20 years. Something like 1,982 students enrolled, and it was just a massive switch. And so we see that again in 47. The class age is very small. The average age of a student for the class of 47 went down from 18 years old, which it had been for the previous decade, to about 17, because again of the draft. And by, let's see, 1944, the college only grants degrees to 51 students, and that's combining 2 classes, that's 44 and 45. So that's how small civilian enrollment was at Dartmouth at one point, which is interesting because you see similar numbers in World War II. And so a lot of colleges are facing serious financial pressures as a result of the draft. Dartmouth was not immune to this, but President Hopkins made serious commitments to the students that Dartmouth would stay open despite the pressures, saying that, as this article shows, that we can absorb a deficit for a few years. But President Hopkins said more than that. He said colleges like ourselves can live through these years on our fat. Many of our smaller institutions of private endowment will be squeezed out. He also said from the time of its foundation, before the War of Revolution until now, Dartmouth has never closed its doors for any war, and that the college would remain open as long as there were any students, which to me is an incredible commitment. As long as there's one civilian student here, Dartmouth would keep its doors open. Just to put it in context, by 1942, most colleges had lost 30% or more of their student bodies. And in the article to the left here, it's quoted that education as usual is out. Every ounce of energy is now devoted to prepare men and women for the fight against Nazism and fascism. And so I have another quote from Peter Beck of 45, who was also in the Oral History of Our Honors Library, who said, then later on, as the war heated up, and everybody knew that they were soon going to be headed off to God knows where, there was a sort of feeling of, you know, you'd lost control of your future, so eat, drink, and be merry. And this, again, a narrative that transcends war, conflict, decade, time, of a kind of loss of agency, so what does it matter? This is the V12 program. This is also a picture from the Dartmouth. It's a little grainy, but it was one of the best that I could find. These are all V12 trainees lined up on the green in formation. It was a massive program. So the V12 begins in 1943, and there's about 2,000 V12 trainees on Dartmouth's campus. It replaces the Naval Indoctrinational School, and the whole campus basically is completely taken over. And I have a map that I found in the government contracts of Honor. This is Dartmouth College at the time, and everything in green is kind of green colored penciled in. These are all buildings that the V12 took over. So they include New Hampshire, Topliff, Ripley, Woodward, Smith, and College Halls. And just like a ton, the whole campus changes in support of the V12 program. And so these are students arriving for the V12 program. The top is, let's see, I think Collis, I think they called it something different at the time. And those are students lining up for their orders, and the bottom is students lining up for their classes. And everything changes. So in 1943, the smallest freshman class in years matriculates, and the college starts imposing stricter rules on life, banning alcohol, female visitors are banned past 7 p.m., and fraternities are done. They're suspended because there's just no civilian students to be a part of them. The Dartmouth as a newspaper is suspended as well. It's left aside for the moment in favor of the Dartmouth Log, which is written by the V12 naval trainees. And even the gym becomes an armory. South Mass is now a sick bay, and there's pictures of people getting their shots, which I couldn't include, but I wish I had now. The gym is an army. It's amazing what they put in the gymnasium, and there's even contracts about like remodeling the gym when they're done with it, and like it being the correct color and fitting in. And so the V12 program is a solution to the fact that the draft is scooping up all the young men 18 and up. There's nobody graduating college to fill the role of officer in the United States Navy. The Navy needs officers, so they partner up with colleges. Dartmouth has the largest V12 program in the country. President Hopkins secured that for the school. And so basically, Dartmouth becomes more or less a naval base in New Hampshire. It's entirely naval trainees, very few civilian enrollment. Things like the library bells, they start marking time in accordance with what the V12 program needs. They play certain songs that the Navy wants. That said, the Navy did not take complete control over Dartmouth. President Hopkins maintained the decision-making powers and had a great deal of influence and control over the program and what would happen and occur. But this was college life at Dartmouth at the time. And so it's an all-in effort. And many professors actually teach outside of their departments in order to accommodate the V12 program. And so that kind of brings me into Dartmouth's faculty. Students were not the only ones going to war and participating in the war effort. This was all in for Dartmouth. And 28 faculty men were serving in active service in 1942. Professors were also leaving for government service. Let's see, departments where they engaged in full-time work for the government, faculty left and were given leave to do so, was administration, archaeology, botany, economics, education, English, geology, history, physical education, physics, philosophy, political science, romance, languages, and zoology. Professors from all of these departments at Dartmouth left to go work for the United States government in various war efforts. The areas of the government in which they worked were the Department of State, the War Shipping and Administration Department, the War Department, the Department of Justice, Defense Research Canada, the Army, and the Navy. And so there's another article called Forgotten Men, which was very interesting to me, written by a student, that talks about this faculty effort. Quoted in the article, it says that, but the fact remains that Dartmouth, the liberal arts college, cannot possibly survive without Dartmouth, the Marine and Naval Training School. We can be a little thankful that Dartmouth had not confined herself to the hiring of men important in one field, but uninterested in little else. It can indulge itself in a pat on the back when it stops for a moment to watch the classics professor at work on his physics homework, which is a reference to the faculty members that taught outside of their fields to accommodate the program. 80 faculty taught outside of their fields for the V12 program, and 46% of the faculty actually taught in the V12 program. And so I found a reflection from Samuel Forman of 46 in the Oral History Archives of Ronner about that experience. And it was a little humorous, so I included it, and I thought it did speak a little bit to the experience. So it says, Geology 13A, the professor had been told that the course was going to be devoted to aerial photography and analysis of photography from the air for military purposes. And this was the only time in my life where really some of us, nobody knew anything, including the professors. And I was able to point out on a couple of occasions mistakes that the professors were making and trying to figure out what this course was all about. So it's just kind of incredible the amount of flexibility the school had and the effort that went into devoting to an all-out war effort. And so by fall of 1944, I found this article, and it's the only one I was able to find over the course of World War II that really talked about casualties. And it was fairly brief. It just says that 134 men had lost their lives and 27 were missing. And it compared it again to World War I. So they're just constantly making this comparison back to World War I, where a total of 111, according to the article, Dartmouth men had lost their lives. Huh?
Or possibly 112.
Or possibly 112. I think I caught that. Yeah.
You had to be here this morning.
Yes. And so it brings us to the end of World War II with the college marking VE Day. And the way that the college marked it was with a parade, fire whistles, library bells, chapel bells. The people of Hanover collected on the green around the flag with what the article referred to as solemn rejoicing. Everyone was aware of and happy that the war was over, but understanding the massive task that lay ahead. The parade consisted of the Dartmouth Band, V12 trainees and high school students, civilian Dartmouth students, and churches open for special services and prayers, and the Dartmouth Glee Club sung patriotic songs. And so with the end of the war, the question of what to do with the V12 program and these naval trainees and where the college will go from here is permeating. Obviously, the V12 program, there's no need for it anymore, so it stops. But many V12 trainees wanted to get a degree at Dartmouth, and being a part of that program did not make you a student at Dartmouth. You were not admitted. And many of them wanted to be admitted and wanted to continue their education. And so the college facilitated that. They decided to transition to a Naval ROTC at the school, which would be present for a long time after. And they even created a brand new degree, a major of naval science, to facilitate the V12 trainees and awarded them credits for some of their training. And so they had that transition with V12. And I believe if you had a minimum of a 1.8 GPA, you were guaranteed, and GPAs were very different back then. But if you had that, you were guaranteed admission, which was a wonderful accommodation that they made for some of these young men. And so the NROTC unit had a lot of aspects to it. They had the east wing of the gymnasium serving as a temporary armory with gun mounts, rangefinders, signal masts, and they were talking about a possibility of constructing an armory in the future. So they were anticipating a long relationship with the Naval ROTC. I found this and I loved it. It may possibly be the very first Dartmouth Veteran Club. I don't know if there were others, but it's possible. It was definitely the first one after World War II. These young men gathered and took a picture and put it in the Dartmouth that they were organizing to facilitate some of the needs that veteran students had at Dartmouth at the time. And they weren't the only ones. These young men came back with their wives and their children. And so I went through a special file called the Special Committee on Academic Adjustments, which was dealing with this issue of veteran students coming back, and they're not the same as they were when they left at 18. They have different needs, they've experienced different things, and they were trying to figure out exactly how to accommodate them and facilitate a good education for them. And these are the numbers who came back from the different classes. Total veterans admitted in just 1945, so this is like right on the tail end, so I'm assuming there were more later, I just hadn't found it. 200 were admitted. 97 of them were part of the V12 program, and 51 were married. And so again and again, as time goes on, I saw stories from veterans, alumni veterans, or students just talking about it was normal to see classmates that had served and that had wives and children, maybe attending a sporting event, they'd be cheering them on. And that was a typical experience right after the war. The college went out of its way to accommodate student veterans at this time. The college designated Mid-Fayweather and South Fayweather as for married students and spouses. They even furnished them with kitchenette units. Dartmouth expected at the time 20% of servicemen returning to be married. They built Sachem Village, so that's the origins of Sachem Village. It was built on property that belonged to the high school at the time. It consisted of about 50 prefabricated houses, 1 or 2 bedroom cottage units, and was temporary. So it was only meant to be there for 5 years and then removed. And so by, like I said before, about 50 married veterans were enrolled by 1945. But we have other changes. It's not just the college adjusting for student veterans and trying to facilitate their educations. We also have the GI Bill around this time, and many students at Dartmouth used its benefits. It would have made a significant dent in their tuition at the time for $500 per year for tuition and fees and a subsistence allowance. And so that brings me really to a close with World War II, which will lead into Korea. And I think underscores these kind of 3 points that I talked about in the beginning, that there's a really strong history with Dartmouth and the military, and that these stories are the same across time in many ways, and that really it was an all-in effort. There was a lot of support and really characterized as a moral obligation to be a part of this war effort. And I will open it up to any questions. Yes.
How was the V12 program paid for? I mean, did the government give Dartmouth?
Yes.
The students weren't involved. The V12 participants didn't pay any out of their own pocket, right? Or
No.
did they?
So the question was how was the V12 program paid for, and how were students financing their involvement in the V12 program? So V12 trainees were actually in the service. They were in the Navy, and they were paid because they were serving in the Navy at the time. And so they didn't have to go and fight because they were in training, but they were in the Navy. And the V12 program paid Dartmouth College to be present on campus. And so that definitely helped with some of the concerns about Dartmouth's finances at the time and remaining open and all of these things. But as President Hopkins said, Dartmouth had money at the time and would have stayed open regardless.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering if there was any discussion about admitting women, or, I mean, I'm obviously comparing this with World War I, and so the V12 basically is the naval sort of, I mean, it's the solution that Dartmouth comes up to with in World War I with the SATC, where basically the government is supporting an army unit on campus, except at that point, all the members of that student training corps had been admitted to Dartmouth. And so, you know, there are some differences here with the V12. But there was discussion, there actually was some discussion in the administration at Dartmouth about admitting women when the draft looks like it's going to take all the Dartmouth students, and then, you know, then they don't do that. I was wondering if there's any discussion of that, or you might not see it in the newspaper. That would be the thing, probably be, you know, the administrative records rather than in the newspaper.
Well, so the question was there discussion about admitting women at the time? I didn't see it in the Dartmouth, and I don't think that's surprising. I believe it was World War II. I did read an article. I'm fairly certain it was about World War II, where a student was reacting to the idea of women serving in the military and was not supportive of that, and said something to the effect of, you know, if the kitchen was good enough for our mothers, it's good enough for them. I read that was definitely published in the Dartmouth. I just have to nail down the date. I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know if the administration talked about admitting women. I know that the administration was really ahead of the country in joining World War II in terms of preparation. President Hopkins believed with certainty that we would join World War II and was prepping the college. That may have been part of the conversation. I just didn't come across it.
The map with the little green colored buildings, you said that the V12 program took over those buildings. In what sense do you mean that? Do they become military buildings? Do they become associated with military activities?
Thank you. So the question is about the map with the green colors for the V12 program. Oh, it went too far. Okay. So when I talk about the V12 taking them over, they're entirely devoted to the V12's operation. So the trainees needed somewhere to live. So for example, Topliff was a dormitory that was completely devoted to V12 trainees. It probably would have facilitated those running the program in terms of controlling what the trainees were up to and enforcing some of those rules I talked about, which were bans on alcohol, bans on women after 7 p.m., and different things about the life of this military unit on campus. And the reason this was interesting to me is they were contractually obligated, the college was, to give the V12 program control over these buildings. So they could use it for things like, some of the buildings were used for training and instruction, and others were for dormitory and just college life, daily life rather. I think there was a question in the back.
So I hadn't realized that the ROTC program actually grew out of the Second World War. It did not exist before that. And it's interesting you compare that to the First World War, because there was an Army training program here. But after the First World War, nothing remained of it. And yet after the Second World War, we retained an ROTC program because of different times, I guess.
And so we're talking about the ROTC program. I'm just repeating for the recording portion. And for the ROTC program, awesome. It's not just that, it's also the degree of naval sciences too. I mean, it's a plan, it seems to me like the idea is some kind of permanence or sustainability of that relationship. I think I saw a question right over here.
So I was curious, you said that only 50 seniors remain on campus?
I think I had the numbers at one, I don't remember off the top of my head. Some very small number, yeah.
So I was just wondering about who those people were and if you saw anything that grew out of their experience. So first off, like, why are they still here?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just that they haven't been drafted, or are they ineligible, or?
I think I think that the people that stayed behind would have been a combination of those that were too young to be drafted, because we saw younger people start trying to go to college, like 17 years old, right before the draft will pick you up. And I think it's also those that maybe couldn't serve. So it's a combination of the two, I think. But I wasn't able to find a whole lot about that because the Dartmouth really shifts, and it's a naval publication. It's not really a student anymore. It's devoted to naval trainees now, and written by them and edited by them. Yeah. I think right here.
Exactly. So was there any conflict between the fact that there was still a traditional Dartmouth here, but there was another?
Yes.
Two completely different entities were living on the same place. There must have been some.
There was some conflict, or I would characterize it more as tension, between the civilian school and the naval presence. Some of that tension revolved around the strict rules in the V12 program. and kind of President Hopkins' idea of what the campus should look like and how it should be. I say that President Hopkins had a great deal, had control over the campus even while the Navy had this massive presence, because there was kind of there's tension going on with the person that was running the V12 program, and that person ended up stepping away from the program and someone else came in, and that was largely because President Hopkins wanted to see some changes, and then the rules became less strict and a little bit more in line with what he was expecting. And so there was tension, but it was resolved by President Hopkins, I would say. And I think I saw a question over here.
So I was just wondering why the Navy, because we're quite a long way from the sea. I mean, you were saying how this is a big program. I mean, why is it particularly a naval operation? Is that just because of her interest in it?
I don't know. I don't.
I can answer it.
Okay.
It's because he was so pissed at what happened with the Army in World War I. No, really, that he started to cultivate the Navy.
Okay.
So it was actually a rejection of the Army ROTC because he thought it had been very badly managed during World War I. And that was one of the reasons why he refused to have ROTC on campus after World War I. So I don't, he presumably had a better opinion of the Navy. I don't know why.
So it comes down to so the reason they chose Navy comes down to tensions between President Hopkins and the Army and past history.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Did I miss any questions? Okay, I don't want to skip anyone. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Now it's going to be strange because you should just change your hat because now you're going to introduce Korea.
Yes.
She's got a lot of work to do.
And let's see if I can actually do that. Wonderful. Okay, let's see if it'll let me pull up Korea. Fantastic. Did I learn technology or not? Okay, yes. Wasn't sure I'd be able to get it to do it right. Fantastic. So World War II really leads into Korea very, very seamlessly almost, I would say. And I looked through, this is more of a higher level overview through Korea, and then the same will apply to Vietnam. But again, I looked through the Dartmouth and was literally looking for that dialogue and what the student experience was, because Dartmouth's relationship with the military and the campus's relationship with the military, to me, is very student-centered. And what I found is that Korea, although I've heard it's called the Forgotten War many, many times, I've heard it referred to it that way, for Dartmouth's campus, I didn't get the impression that it was forgotten. It was definitely present. People were talking about it. And the war, the relationship with the military that Dartmouth had really changed the physical space of the campus at this time, just like we saw in World War II with kind of these different buildings designated and changes that way. But that the military relationship will continue to endure as we saw through World War II. And so the War Stories course, now we're getting into a little more of the living memory. And in our War Stories course, many of the students were able to actually interview Korean War veterans and Dartmouth alumni. And this one was done by Taylor Mooney in the class. This is a quote from Daniel Boyd of 53, who served in the Marine Corps. He said, "In 1949, the war was over, the nation at peace, and most of my classmates were looking to eventual careers in business or industry." And so that kind of characterizes the space that we're walking into as we begin to look at what's coming next in the Korean War. And when I say that the campus changed the physical space because of their support of the military and their very strong relationship with the military, I can point to a very specific example of Reed Hall. So in the description of Dartmouth College, which was kind of a publication booklet to describe the college to prospective students and their parents, this is a picture that was published there, and they actually call it the SS Reed Hall. And so what the SS Reed Hall was, I was so excited when I found this. The basement of Reed Hall was kind of taken over by the Naval ROTC unit, and it was used for all kinds of training. And this is a blueprint plans for the basement related to a piece of equipment called an attack teacher, that the Navy paid for all of this, by the way, and installed all of these things. And what it was is it modeled after a destroyer, and these would be all like all of the battle stations that a person, and I think that's the right term for it, forgive me, I wasn't in the Navy, but I think they're called battle stations, all the different features that someone might find on a ship that they would need to train on. And so students in the ROTC would go and they would do these kinds of trainings. The attack teacher was pretty cool. I tried to figure out what it was, but it's an old piece of equipment, so it was a little hard to find. As best as I could figure out, it seems to me that it was a table of sorts that a student would kind of sit under with a periscope-like device and practice identifying targets in a ship for attack and that kind of thing. And so this was a contract I found in the government contracts box in Ronner. The librarians were wonderful and helped me find that. This was not the only thing. So I mentioned that the gym was an armory. Part of it was an armory. They decided to move some of that equipment into Reed Hall. So there's all kinds of interesting things there. They've got a torpedo, a depth charge, a mine, a K-gun, which I believe was to project the depth charges, and they move all of that in. And so we're kind of falling in on the Naval ROTC presence on campus, but then the Korean War breaks out, and we have a draft. And so there are different student reactions. And so what happened was when this happens, it's over the summer. And I find that again with Vietnam. When it's over the summer, the Dartmouth isn't printing, so there's not a reaction to find. It doesn't mean there wasn't one. So I have a student reaction from 1951 talking about the idea of having to go to war. And this student says, yet if a man's got to march and kill and die, shouldn't he have some ideals? Shouldn't he choose to give his life rather than surrender his life away? But he has no choice. He's in the army, so what the hell? And maybe, after all, maybe he won't have to fight. Maybe his draft car will be lost in a fire. And maybe everything will smooth over before they get to him. This quote spoke to me because it talks about all of those things we saw in World War II. It's the idea that, well, wait, shouldn't I have a chance to go to college first? Like, this seems a little abrupt, but I have no choice in this, I have no agency. And then also kind of the idea, well, maybe it'll pass me over, but you know that it won't. And so I thought it was an interesting quote to speak about. And so you've got students talking about the war and it's affecting them, but they don't know about deferments. That question is unanswered. And there's a lot of concerns around the idea of being drafted, including, well, what branch would I go to? At the time, the Army was where you would be drafted into. What would be the length of my enlistment? That all varied based on how you entered. And the government was trying to find a way to balance it and not scoop up all of the college students at one time as well, to avoid the problems that led to units like the V12. And so the dean of the college actually gave the entire college advice. There's a huge article in the Dartmouth at the time about what to do. And he said, quote, "I firmly believe that any student who wants to stay in college, wants to spend the minimum period of military service, will find the risk of staying in college subject to the draft we're taking. Any man in the class of 52, and he was also referring to 53, whose enlistment may prevent his finishing 2 years of college, has more to lose than he can gain by enlisting at this time." And so there was a national kind of narrative of join, choose, have some agency over this, do it now before we do it for you, kind of. And the dean of the college is saying, don't do that, stay in school, which is a different narrative from what we see in World War II. In World War II, the college is literally training up students before we even join the war, with the idea that everyone will go in for this effort. And now in Korea, it's not saying don't join, it's just saying hang out for a minute, wait until it's your turn to join. And so it is a subtle shift in the message from the college, but it is a shift, I felt. And so what's really cool is that you see at the same time, the Dartmouth is talking about what my entire research was about, that ever-present question and the relation of the college and the student to the draft and really the military. And they're quoting that and they're talking about that in their articles. But eventually this uncertainty has some clarity and we come to some decisions nationwide about what the draft's going to look like, what deferments are going to happen, what the rules will be. And the Dartmouth covers that quite a bit. And their reaction is, at least this one aspect is coming to an end of the nervousness regarding the war. And so different things kind of change around it. Students before they were enlisting to ensure they could choose their branch. With the new rule, students could finish their academic year and be inducted into the branch of their choice, assuming that there were openings. This was an immediate relief for students, but they were still faced with kind of a why bother attitude. This is going to happen to me anyway. Great, I get to choose my branch, but it's kind of a consolation prize to some of them at the time. So there's a lot of things that go along with the draft. One of them is a national examination. So you have to take a test to see how you're doing and if you can qualify to stay in school. This is from a quote from Bradley Corrigan, a 52, served in the Marine Corps, who was interviewed by Noah Reed and Chae-Yoon Kim in the War Stories course in fall of 2018. He said people who didn't pass the exam were drafted into the Army, and there were a number of those in his experience at Dartmouth College. And so we have this question of the draft. I want to finish school. That's the narrative going on. How do I finish school? ROTC. So the Army brings ROTC to Dartmouth's campus, and the Air Force comes as well. This is in 1951. The Army announces that they are bringing their presence to Dartmouth. And the ROTC is a way for students to kind of defer, to wait, to not have to get drafted and to be able to finish their degree. Dartmouth categorizes that whole relationship in the Dartmouth description, saying, in the interest of national security and the cooperation of the Department of Defense, Dartmouth College offers as part of its regular curriculum training courses leading to commissions in the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force. And so that's how the college characterizes its decision to allow and to bring ROTC onto campus, and they advertise this openly to students. So it's a point of attraction for students to the school. And so this is reflection from Buck Scott, a 51, who served in the Army, from an alumni magazine article. He said, I spent my Dartmouth years protected from service because I was a full-time student. By December of 1951, I was a volunteer in the U.S. Regular Army. On my way for infantry basic training, I thought, let's just face it, the fates will decide. This is a great picture of the Army ROTC, again, in Dartmouth's description of the college that they printed. They grabbed pictures from every single ROTC, beautiful pictures, full pages. And it's a little bit interesting, though, because the ROTC programs today, what college you go to doesn't dictate the job you're going to get, but it did back then. Army ROTC students here, when they graduated, were looking forward to careers in ordnance. It was specific for the other ROTC programs as well, which I found quite interesting. Navy ROTC was a little more, they had different options than the other ones did. But everyone got a little bit of pay for doing it. These are students at Dartmouth doing a gun drill. I thought that was a really neat picture. And then we have Air Force ROTC as well on campus. Again, your college dictated your career options. For the Air Force ROTC, it was comptrollership, administration, flight operations, and things of that nature. And so by 1951, all of them are on Dartmouth's campus. And so as we were kind of thinking about deferments and all of these things, the Dartmouth and having a presence of ROTC, we find again that there's now a lower draft age, which we see kind of repeated through the wars, is that they start kind of higher age and they go down to lower. We saw it in World War II. And so the draft age gets lowered down to 8.5 years old. And they're expecting an impact on the campus. President Dickey at the time expected a 25 to 30% enrollment drop in 52 and a possible loss to the college of $1 million. So all of these drops in enrollment that we see across the wars do cost the college financially, and they impact these kinds of questions as the college plans. So I have another reflection from Bradley Corrigan, a 52, interviewed by Noah Reed in the War Stories course. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps. He said, I knew I was going to be drafted after I graduated, so I got on a train, went down to Boston, and I enlisted in the Marine Corps. A lot of students did this at the time. They took some agency over and decided, well, if I'm going to go, I'm going to go how I want to go, and I'm going to do it the way that I want to do it, in the branch I want to do it, and so forth. And so this is another reflection. This was from a Dartmouth alumni magazine from John A. Hoskins, a 51 who served in the Marine Corps. Said, on a beautiful June morning in 1951, I put on a long black robe to walk with my classmates to receive our coveted bachelor's degrees. 20 minutes later, I was dressed in a green uniform, being sworn into the U.S. Marines. I'm headed for graduation in a few months, and I couldn't imagine. You go from one to the other immediately. Again, Dartmouth College is making accommodations for students. They go, from my perspective, I feel like they went out of their way at the time. They're awarding credit for students who are in good standing and get drafted in the middle of their terms. They had different options for it, partial credit, full credit, and different eligibility requirements. But basically, if you were called up, Dartmouth didn't want you to lose out on all the work that you had done, and they wanted to be fair to their students and to do what they could. And so this was kind of one way in which they did that. Bradley Corrigan, who I quoted before, said there wasn't too much interest in the war because we were kind of focused in Hanover. You were kind of isolated from the rest of the world. We knew in general what was going on, and we knew that they had a forced draft program. We just accepted it, and we did what we had to do. So even though all of this is going on around students, even though it's, there's articles about it, there's the draft, all these things are happening, somehow still we have a little bit of a Dartmouth bubble, which I thought was very interesting. We have it in World War II, we have it here. So it's a different perspective that endures for students. So as you've got different students engaged in different ways with the idea of having to serve, faculty are debating whether or not we should be in Korea. And so the majority supported it, and we see this across the board in Korea. Majority, we're okay, we're fine with involvement. And the faculty broadly supported it. One of the main things that they said was that U.S. with early withdrawal might look bad for U.S. international reputation. And so that was one reason that many supported staying and finishing in Korea. And we see another poll. This really got my attention. The faculty were wondering if students would possibly maybe not focus as much on their academics because of the distraction of the war. And what they found was the opposite, although they did note that the students seemed a little nervous or something along those lines. And the reason that they didn't see students, the apathy or anything like that reflect in courses, is because your performance in your courses was your whole reason for getting a deferment in many cases. And so it wouldn't make really sense for students to slack off in their classes. In fact, I would have expected them to do better, but basically they saw them doing about the same. But I saw over and over again through the Dartmouth that narratives of the Korean War were present. The Dartmouth continually printed Associated Press articles about different newsworthy aspects of the war, and we're tracking the events very much. It was not tracked in the way that World War II was. It was not tracked from the same perspective that World War II was by any means. It was a drastic difference. So comparing the two, it might look like this wasn't paid attention to, but it surely was. There was a narrative ongoing throughout the entire time in the Dartmouth and with students. Not everyone participated in that. Some were in a Dartmouth bubble of their own. But this was part of what was going on at the time. But this brings us to the end of the Korean War, and something I found in the alumni magazine that really caught my attention. This is from Henry Nachman of 51, who served in the U.S. Army, and he was present for the some of the final shots that were fired in the Korean War. He said, on July 27th of 1953 at 10 in the morning was when the war stopped, but not when the shooting stopped. At 10 that night, the shooting stopped. It was eerie. The very last man who died in the Korean War at 7:30 that night was a sergeant first class in my company. His name was Harold Cross. And so I just thought it impacted me that, first, the narrative that he shared, and that we had an alum that was a witness to this moment. And so with the end of the war, as we had with the end of World War II, the question of ROTC and the college's relationship with the military is posed again. But ROTC remains on campus, and it remains on campus for a few years, although in a smaller capacity. The budgets are cut, and they're just not as necessary as they were before. That doesn't mean there wasn't a need. There still was definitely an ongoing need for the ROTC. And so with the Korean War, our course had the first living voices available to us. We had 3 Korean War veterans that were interviewed for the War Stories course. And for all, the war was an expected responsibility and something that they were engaged with during their undergraduate experience. And so Vitalia prepared some remarks about one of the interviews that she did with the course and on a specific alumni veteran. And so I'll invite her up to speak a little bit more about that. And as we transition, I just want to give an opportunity for any questions that anyone might have. Wonderful. All right, great.
Hello. So I got out of the Army in May of 2018. It was an interesting idea to know that I was heading to Dartmouth from the Army. And so when I was enrolling for classes, I saw a class, comparative literature class called War Stories. And I thought, that would be a really nice way to transition, right? It's a really unique fear, because I felt pretty brave, I felt pretty empowered, and I felt pretty strong. But the idea that you're going into a liberal arts environment with people maybe having conceptions of your service that would make you uncomfortable, to me, the idea of talking about it in a classroom environment would be nice. In Professor Stewart's comparative literature class, we explored complex themes of surrounding war and trauma, collective and social accountability, life, grief, and survivorship. And we did all of this through the context of the war story. We studied fiction, nonfiction, everything from the Korean War, the Japanese War, World War II narratives. I don't know that we left any war story untouched. At the end of this class, the culminating project was to interview a Korean War veteran. It was during this process that I was introduced to Korean War veteran, Marine Corps Colonel, retired, James Jerry Mitchell. Jerry Mitchell had over 37 years of combined service between the Navy and the Marine Corps. You don't often hear numbers that high anymore. So he commissioned as an officer in the Navy and the Marine Corps. After returning from the Korean War, Jerry graduated with his MBA from Tuck. He did work for a few years with the Federal Reserve, and then he accepted a position with IBM and stayed with the company for 18 years. Jerry left IBM, came back to Hanover, and opened and operated the Dartmouth Travel Bureau. And speaking with Jerry, I realized that his freshman year experience was a little different, but also very similar to my own. He hopped on a bus, rode up to Dartmouth, sight unseen, enrolled, and went to his dorm room. There was nothing novel about it. There wasn't anything super strange about it. He was ready to start learning. It felt very familiar to me talking to Jerry about his experience transitioning from living at home in high school and going to college. There were a couple of things, though, that started to come up that very much distinguished his experience at Dartmouth from my own. One of his quotes said, "Dartmouth was like you experienced. I came as a freshman, I got on a bus, changed buses to a train, and took the train to White River." It sounds pretty normal. The first few clear differences as we spoke, though, were really clear. His quote, "There was a veteran on every floor of Guile Hall when I came to Dartmouth." The saturation of the veteran population was a side effect of both relatively consistent service conscription from 1948 through 1973 and the all-male student body. In the current era of the all-volunteer service, Dartmouth College is home to less than 50 undergraduate students. And that's in the light of being at war for the last 18 years. While many would not consider that number significant, it is important to note that Dartmouth has distinguished itself among its peers in prioritizing enrolling veteran students. Jerry was a big part of contributing to that narrative. I did want to talk to Jerry about the way that the shadow of conscription can kind of change the way that you engage with the Dartmouth College and kind of your education in general. And this was another point that I started to notice a very different experience between what I expected and to some degree what I think I would have projected on my older veterans. Jerry didn't feel a shadow. He didn't notice a shadow. Almost half of his class had served. He intended to serve. It wasn't novel to him, the idea of service. And he said, it was just my reality. In Jerry's sophomore year, his brother left home for college as well, and he decided to take a couple years off and go ahead and seek a commission in the United States Navy so that he could ease the financial burden on his family. And there is another distinction, the idea that you would willingly step away from your education, not for some higher calling, which a lot of people maybe would kind of attribute that decision to, but his consideration of his family and their financial struggles, and the idea that maybe going to war was the best way to ease that struggle. So Jerry applied to and was accepted to the Naval Academy flight program as a cadet. In March of 1950, Lieutenant Mitchell started his flight training at the Naval Air Station in Whiting Field and completed his first solo flight on April 12th. At this point in the interview, Jerry's wife, I was welcomed into their home right here in Hanover. At this point in the interview, Jerry's wife hopped up and just left. She just left the room, which I thought was interesting, but she'd been bringing us tea and kind of facilitating a discussion the entire time. She came back with stuff. There were pictures, there were flight uniforms, there were medals, there were models of his big girl and his little girl, both his favorite aircraft to fly. One of the pictures that she brought out, Nancy brought out, was a picture of his squadron holding their guidon. This picture was especially significant to me because one of the members of the squadron was a black man. David Plowden was the third ever Negro aviation cadet. There was no problem whatsoever, not that I knew. We had the same aerial number, same MOS number, and they were a part of the group. I struggled with this concept of this casual reference to integration in the Army, the Navy. It was a time in this country where it was really, really difficult to discuss integration and race. Jerry didn't have that problem. There was a quiet professionalism and a really, really deliberate respect for professional proficiency that transcended race. And it was also on the heels of, it was especially significant because it was on the heels of the integration of the military force broadly under the Truman administration. So Jerry, who attended an all-white high school, attends flight school with the third black aviation cadet ever admitted to the program. And then less than 2 weeks later, on June 25th of 1950, the professional practicality with which Lieutenant Mitchell's wing approached integration would prove fortuitous as the government of North Korea attacked the sovereign nation of South Korea. And this team was going to be headed to a Marine Corps mobilized for war. As we continued through our interview, we started touching on Jerry's transition from training as a cadet to an active duty pilot. In 1951, Second Lieutenant James Mitchell received his orders and headed to Atami Airfield in Japan, and then on to K-1 Busan, Korea. He was given his final assignment with the VMF 212 in Pohang. Again, this is when Nancy hops up and does something really funny. She goes and grabs another box of things, and she's like, "Jerry, you should tell her about your award." I am 100% convinced that Jerry would not have mentioned his award had his wife not prompted him to do so. Jerry received the Distinguished Flying Cross while he was in service to the United States Navy. It's awarded by the President of the United States for heroism or extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. It's a very significant award, one of which Jerry would not have mentioned to me had Nancy not prompted him to. In late August of 1952, Second Lieutenant Mitchell provided close air support while under direct fire for a fellow downed pilot in the Wonson Harbor area. Now, the significance of that, sometimes you have to go through and kind of translate military awards because they can sometimes be sanitized. The significance of Jerry's actions is that there was a downed pilot. The pilot was in an effort trying to survive, and Jerry was providing cover. The part that you don't understand necessarily in that award language is that the same anti-aircraft weaponry that downed the previous pilot was shooting at Jerry while he was operating his aircraft. So this is when I get really excited because you don't get to have these kinds of conversations often. Every effort that I made to properly aggrandize Jerry's Jerry's actions was minimized. It was not important. It was actively refuted every time he said, "I just did my job." When I was caught in a difficult situation, all I did was survive. When asked if it was his job to leverage his safety to keep someone else alive, he replies with a casual "yeah." And I think he was just too polite to say, "So what?" Jerry stayed in the area, providing cover fire for that pilot until he was forced to land in a nearby airfield because his plane ran out of gas. He realized the weight of his actions when only after someone told him that he would be receiving the award, and he calls it a small award by his reckoning. Second Lieutenant Mitchell left the Korean War after flying 88 successful missions and receiving 4 air medals for his efforts. Upon completing his active duty commitment, Jerry returned to Dartmouth College to finish his bachelor's degree and check in with the local reserve unit, where he would fly with the Marine Reserves of New England for 19 more years. Life after Korea was a little bit different, but primarily because Jerry began school as a 17-year-old freshman and returned as a 22-year-old senior. That's something I kind of have in common with Jerry. I'm a 30-year-old sophomore. His service allowed him to use the GI Bill to attend school for free, and he was accepted into Tuck Business School immediately following graduation. When his friends asked Jerry what he did while he was supporting the Korean War, this is another moment that I recognized a difference. I think it's a humility that has kind of been codified into men like Jerry and men who have a history of service like Jerry. I got 9 credits for being an officer and a gentleman, 6 credits for learning how to fly, and I spent my junior year abroad. That was both an incredible summation of his military career, but it very succinctly kind of demonstrates the kind of humility and a little bit of self-deprecation that a lot of these individuals who have served our country historically tend to provide. Jerry's practicality and quiet strength and obvious humility was evident when I was discussing putting his education on hold to support his family and to serve his country, ease the burden on hardworking parents, and the assertions that he was just doing his job when saving the lives of fellow Navy pilots. Jerry presents a humility and quality of character that winds thematically through our interview. The likes of men like James Jerry Mitchell, class of '51, have inspired schools like Dartmouth to invest in veterans. That investment is why I am here. I am a female, Black, queer veteran student at Dartmouth College, and I'm the child of a single mother. It was never my wildest dream that I could end up in a place like this, and that I could end up in a place like this without insurmountable amounts of debt. and the GI Bill and Dartmouth College has gone out of their way to facilitate that experience. My participation at an institution like Dartmouth College is predicated on the efforts of brave souls who both quietly and loudly and in different ways demonstrated practicality, kindness, and steadfast belief in the defense of what is right. All right, so does anyone have any questions? Any questions? Yes.
Well, I guess I was thinking that when he left Dartmouth to go into the military, that was before the war had started.
Mm-hmm.
So the I was kind of putting this together. So he didn't necessarily think he was going to war.
Right, he did it
Right.
so that he could ease the financial
Right,
burden on his
exactly.
family, and then he ended up
Right. Exactly.
at war.
Yeah. I think that probably wasn't. I mean, I think that was probably something that was fairly common in that period, because it's a generation that's come, after World War II. So service in the Army is something that lots of families have or expect or whatever, and so. Just kind of putting those things together. I think probably other people would have been, other men would have probably been thinking the same thing, other students.
Mm-hmm.
Can I speak to that? Actually, you're right. One of the things that we saw, I think, across the student interviews for the Korean and Vietnam era veterans are the number of ROTC students, and many of them are responding to financial considerations for their families. There were lots of motives for ROTC participation, but very many Dartmouth students talked about coming to Dartmouth and using ROTC as a way to mitigate the costs on their families. That said, just this weekend, a Dartmouth alum said to me that the three characteristics of Dartmouth that he had to impress upon me for the 60s were: 1, women weren't here; 2, the campus was mostly white; and 3, the whites were privileged. And that he contrasted today as a good thing, as a changed campus, but yet and still across the interviews, and Vitalia's interview, very, very many of these interviews, the young men spoke about ROTC as something they did to help with college as a natural decision.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conceptions about the generational wealth that Dartmouth produces, and I think it was really interesting to have a conversation with a veteran who had to overcome the projections or perceptions of generational wealth by taking time off and serving his country. I thought that was an interesting nuance that I think a lot of students and a lot of people overlook in general. Any other questions? Yeah.
So having done the War Stories class with Professor Stewart, and you as a vet, how has your participation in this class shaped your Dartmouth experience overall after?
So the question was, how has it shaped my overall experience at Dartmouth? So Professor Stewart's War Stories class, I think, was a really great introduction to the liberal arts education. I was sorely misinformed about what a liberal arts education was. I heard the word liberal, and being from the South, I had a very interesting conception of what I was about to be meeting up here at Dartmouth. And I come to learn that liberal arts is less a very small box about thinking and more interested in exposing you to a litany of different things so you learn how to think. Her class showed me that the type of student that I would engage here at Dartmouth would not be the kind of student I was expecting. I was expecting a class of I think we read the news and we hear a lot about entitlement. We hear a lot about demanding, lazy young people. And I was ready to kind of butt up against that. And I learned in that class that these students are a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more diligent and a little bit more open-minded than I thought they were. I was expecting everything from baby killer to even worse slurs than that. And what I got were really thoughtful questions about how war shaped my life. What does trauma look like? How can we support veterans? And what's missing in support for veterans? So it shaped my life here, or my experience here at Dartmouth in the sense that I see my peers as peers, not as youth or lazy young people. They're my peers and I can learn from them, and that was interesting. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
I'm not that great with the tech, but I'm going to transition into my presentation on Vietnam. Sorry, everyone. Let's see if I can get to the correct slide here. Oh dear. Oh dear. That's weird. It shouldn't be stuck there. I'm sorry, give me one moment. Okay. Oh dear. Please work. I sure hope it works. Okay, maybe we're good now. Are we good? Perhaps. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, wonderful. Sorry, my apologies to everyone. Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about Dartmouth and the Vietnam War. And as we transition from Korea, I've just prepared again a general overview of Vietnam and what I found through my research in the Dartmouth as a window into the voices of the dialogue on campus and the happenings. And so I think what we would probably all expect to see is a lack of support for the war in general, and that is what I found largely in the Dartmouth by faculty and by students. And when it culminates at the end of the Vietnam conflict is a loss of the military relationship between Dartmouth and the military. Sorry, redundant. And so I wanted to start, again, just kind of setting the scene with an interview that I had the privilege of conducting with George Bollinger, a 63, who was in the US Navy. He took the time to speak with me, and I was very appreciative of that and very privileged for having the opportunity to do so. He said that back in those days, even if no one was interested in fighting a war, there was a much stronger feeling of owing the country something. And I think that that was very reflective of the country, the campus, the student body at the time, a sense of duty, a sense of service as we exit Korea. And then, of course, we all know about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution authorizing US military action in response. And so this is from an interview in the War Stories course done by two students, Alex Rivlin and Kyle Ziemer, in fall of 2018. The interview was with Ronald Brown, a 68, who served in the US Army. He said, in the summer of '64, my parents and I drove up to Dartmouth. Johnson had just announced the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I remember sitting in the motel watching it on television, and that was probably the first very real awareness that something was about to happen. And he couldn't have been more right. So we've got the Vietnam War kicking off. Things are happening. And the United States Army is communicating with Dartmouth and President Dickey about how important the ROTC program is to the United States Army, to the war effort, to the nation, and to the Secretary of the Army himself. Secretary Ailes wrote in his 1965 letter to President Dickey that the ROTC program is of singular importance to the Army and to the defense of our country. He said, "I'm sure that we can count on your continuing support." I think this is a little bit of an appeal for continuing support. He was not exaggerating when he said it was of singular importance. 45% of the Army's 100,000 officers came from the ROTC at that time. World War officers were retiring, and the Army was anticipating a larger and larger role for ROTC candidates. The ROTC at the time provided the Army with 22 times the officers that West Point provided, and 85% of second lieutenants were ROTC graduates. These were all facts that Secretary Ailes shared with President Dickey in his letter, underscoring his perception that there was a continuing need for the presence at Dartmouth campus and the desire to facilitate that relationship. And so I go on to continue to quote Mr. Bollinger. He said, "Nobody was looking at the military as a career. You were doing your duty." Again, with a sense of service. I specifically asked him whether or not this was a career option for students because I was curious. Were people looking to do this for the rest of their lives, or why were they joining at the time? And this was why. It was, again, a sense of service. Another interview from War Stories course done by Alex Rivlin and Kyle Zemer, Mr. Ronald Brown, 68, who served in the Army, said that he was just talking about kind of that sense of duty of some students at Dartmouth to serve their country. One specific was a freshman named Rod Smith that he encountered, who was a class of 70. Mr. Brown said he had a conversation at the end of his fall term with this freshman about the idea of leaving to join the Marine Corps, and that he would always remember sitting up on the 4th floor, I believe it was New Hampshire Hall, in the corridor on the floor, having this conversation with him. The bottom line was that this student felt he was given enough to have been able to go to college, but that wasn't a reason for him to not, in his terms, do his duty. He ultimately withdrew from school, and this student, Rod Smith, joined the Marine Corps in late '67. But not everyone felt that way about the military, and some alums, some students who went and served and came back, in the case of Anthony Thompson, a 64, who served proudly in the United States Army, did not necessarily receive a warm reception from particular students. In this case, Mr. Thompson was relaying an experience he had in an interview with Jack Schmidt and Ubaldo Lopez in the War Stories course. He said that he was in a fraternity on Dartmouth campus and was called by a brother a moral coward for having served in Vietnam. So there were many opinions, and many of them very much so conflicting at this time on Dartmouth campus. Another alum, Robbie Holman, a 72, who served in the United States Army, was quoted in the Alumni magazine having said it was virtually unanimous. People were opposed to the war. Bob Dylan was saying the times they are a-changin', and it was true. And it was definitely true on Dartmouth campus. There were protests that happened. This one happened in May of '68. The ROTC used to have awards that they would give their students for their performance in the programs at the end of the year. This one was in the spring, in May. And you can see the picture of them receiving awards. For this particular ceremony, about 300 people, a mix of faculty and students, protested it. But this is just kind of a preliminary, a lead up. This is the occupation of Parkhurst Hall, where anti-ROTC dissidents seized it. They completely occupied it, barricading themselves in. Police had to remove them. Many were arrested, some were expelled. And this was in direct reaction to the presence of ROTC on campus. There were many students on campus that believed that ROTC should not exist here, that it should be ejected from the campus, and that in no way should Dartmouth College facilitate any relationship with the military. And so Douglas Lamoot, a 65, who served in the United States Army, was asked about this. And he said that with regard to Vietnam, sometimes he would talk to some of those that were against it and maybe protesting perhaps. He said, how can one be so sure of one's position if one cannot even find that place on a map? He would ask them if they could point out Vietnam, and some of them couldn't. He said, it seems to me that such basic information, if one can't find it on a map, I'm forced to ask myself, what else is this person missing about this issue or topic or position? So there were just many different conflicting views on campus. But this interweaves itself with a national dialogue of protests, and the Dartmouth covered that along the way. There are many articles about different activities on a nationwide scale. And this one is of a massive protest in DC where 250,000 protesters showed up. And this leads us into the draft. December 1st, 1969, the Selective Service does the very first lottery since 1942, and the Dartmouth covers it. Just to put it in perspective, broadly, the number of inductions that we see in Vietnam are about 1.8 million, and the number for Korea is about 1.5 for the total war. And it's a little ahead of myself, but I thought it would be worth mentioning that the last person who's inducted would be June 30th of 1973. And eventually, students that want that ROTC, that military relationship severed at Dartmouth campus, and I'm sure some faculty as well, they win. And the ROTC does agree to exit campus. The question really at this point is not whether ROTC will stay, it's how they're going to withdraw from the campus without causing harm to those students that are enrolled in these programs. Many of them had money involved, scholarship type, I think scholarship might be the wrong word, but there were funds associated with it and different things. And so that was kind of the question, and that dictates some of the withdrawal dates that we see. 1973 is of note. That's the withdrawal date for the Navy. I think it's interesting they're the last to withdraw, probably because they had the strongest relationship and perhaps higher student involvement in the program, which would mean more students would need to be able to stay in the program the full 4 years. But what we'll see is that, at least for the Air Force, they don't stay nearly as late. They don't even stay till 71. The last student that the Air Force has, which is acknowledged in this letter to the trustees in 74, the very last student they have in their program is in 1968. So there's waning student interest as well. And so by 1970, there's the idea of having a college strike nationwide in reaction to Nixon's announcement of involvement in Cambodia. And this is the Dartmouth article about that. The very next day after that article, we have articles about Kent State. The one on the left is about the incident with Kent State where the university students were shot by National Guardsmen. And the article on the right is President Kemeny announcing that classes, the whole college is going to take a break for a week and suspend everything. And I think in part this is a reflection on what had happened previously with Parkhurst Hall and an avoidance of maybe incidents like that, but also clearly for reflection, clearly to think about it and to think about what positions we should hold on the war and how we should respond to all this. And they do the whole week long. In fact, you see articles not said people who were interested, so referring to what happens to these students when ROTC is gone. And in his experience, in his memory, they went to Norwich University over in Vermont, but the whole Ivy League dropped out. It was a massive protest against the idea of having this connection. This was not unique to Dartmouth in any way. But it's not just ROTC that ends. All of the changes that happened at the end of World War II, where we see the degree of naval science introduced and ROTC and all these relationships with this idea that they'll probably endure, they're gone. Between 1972 and 1971, the ORC no longer mentions the degree of naval science. So that's not a part of the college experience here anymore. And so the Dartmouth does cover when the Vietnam Accord is signed. January of 73, there's a ceasefire. March of 73, the last combat troops leave South Vietnam. And I found a reaction in the Dartmouth Alumni magazine by Warren Cook, a 67 who served in the U.S. Marines, just characterizing the end of the war and how he felt about it. He said, everybody totally avoided discussing it. There was no acknowledgement of what we did. Thank you for your service. Did not even appear in people's vocabularies. And so these are all just some of the perspectives at the time. This last one is just one perspective of many. Our Dartmouth the War Stories course that Professor Stewart put on in the fall featured interviews that students did with many alumni from the Vietnam War, and all of them had different perspectives. And so I would like to pause for a moment for questions and then invite Paula up to talk about one of her interviews with a particular alum. So are there any questions that anyone might have? Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Paula, and before I start, I would just like to thank Nataly for this amazing presentation she put together, and Professor Stewart for allowing me to contribute in the panel. While I was preparing for my presentation, I was not only filled with the unusual nervousness, but I also pondered what is it that makes war stories so captivating for writers. When revisiting my paper from last fall, I realized that war stories have this special power to inspire but also to captivate brutal reality. Before taking the War Stories course, however, I only could remember one book that captivated me, Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. This book not only motivated me to take the course, but also helped me to choose one of Mr. Frondorf, one of the many veterans who participated in the Vietnam War. Those of you who know and read the novel can understand how excited I was to interview Mr. Frondorf and finally meet with the real heroes of Vietnam. However, at the end of October, when I could finally set up my interview with Mr. Frondorf, to my biggest surprise, I did not meet with the idealized trauma hero of Vietnam. Neither did I hear a recap of O'Brien's dramatic jungle stories. What I heard turned out to be far more interesting. The interview with Mr. Frondorf revealed a new perspective of the Vietnam conflict at Dartmouth and challenged the literary perspective of the Vietnam War. Last but not least, it questioned the representation of the ex-military personnel as a trauma hero. As an international student who is not an expert at Dartmouth history, I was excited to learn a new perspective on the 60s general anti-war movements. Mr. Frondorf's testimony not only showed that Dartmouth at the time was a place of political contradiction, but also pointed out that the students of the college managed to build meaningful relationships. Dartmouth, although considered, quote, as an extreme place of liberalism, was represented both by conservative and anti-war sentiments. For instance, shared Mr. Frondorf, when I showed up as a freshman, I was assigned to a faculty advisor. I had a guy who was a French teacher, and he asked me what I was planning to do. And I said, I was interested in architecture and being an English major. I also mentioned that I was interested in ROTC, and he spent the next half hour trying to talk me out of it. According to Mr. Frondorf, who was a student between the ages of 1965 and 69, the faculty of Dartmouth College almost unanimously objected the war, but the students experienced an equal divide. Although substantially fewer students joined the military during the Vietnam era than World War I or World War II, the members of the Army, Air Force, and Navy ROTC programs still applied to service. Approximately 10% of the student body could have signed up for service. Although the protests against the ROTC and the counter-protests against the SDS were recurring events on campus, the student body continued to have an open dialogue. Peaceful interaction and dialogue between ROTC members and conscientious objectors were not obliterated. Mr. Frondorf, for example, managed to develop and maintain a meaningful relationship with his roommate, who was a conscientious objector. My roommate, he said, was a conscientious objector, but I had plenty of friends who were in ROTC with me, so I had a range of friends who were either against or not. For my friends at Dartmouth, it's that roommate that I still regularly see. And of course, he was a captain of industry. Now it seems a little bit ironic that he was a conscientious objector. Nevertheless, he's a great guy. As we can see, their friendship proves that with an open mind, some of the students of Dartmouth College could bridge ideological differences and manage to preserve Dartmouth's legacy for inclusivity. Dartmouth history, however, was not the only perspective that I was revealed after the interview. To my biggest surprise, Mr. Frondorf's testimony pointed out that the traditional Vietnam War hero portrayed as a victimized pacifist was not always the real-life protagonist. In fact, many citizens supported the war. Mr. Frondorf was one of the many young adults who supported the national agenda, prepared, and was looking forward to service. As a member of the ROTC at Dartmouth and the son of a Navy officer, he was excited to get into the hustlers. With his international experience as a child growing up in the Philippines, he considered that the US should intervene, and he wanted to walk the walk. When he first arrived to his ship, he desperately wanted a job and wanted to do the whole thing as correctly as he could. His experience suggested that besides the stories of brutalized and disillusioned war hero, there is space for a narrative of preparation and conscious choice. While the disillusionment of the 60s national propaganda and the anti-war movement created a literary legacy of reasonless war featuring the disillusioned war hero, Mr. Frondorf highlighted that we should not accept the narrative of the counterculture as the only experience. Nonetheless, Mr. Frondorf's international perspective and cross-cultural experience questioned the culture shock narrative used in many Vietnam War novels. Indeed, we could ask, what else would make a better war story than a hero who battles with culture shock and the unpredictability of nature? Even in my favorite war novels, like Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, the narrator highlights the discomfort caused by the unfamiliarity of the environment. After talking to Mr. Frondorf, however, I recognized that the culture shock of younger American soldiers is not the only narrative. Mr. Frondorf, who spent his childhood in the Philippines and had a broader worldview, did not experience culture shock. Nonetheless, arriving in Vietnam in 1971, a relatively peaceful year, Mr. Frondorf was in a safer position. Although his initial experience when flying in included, quote, that unusual sensation that there are people down there that want to kill him, he quickly settled into the normality of Saigon. Since 1971, the political powers already started negotiations and the process of Vietnamization. Saigon was a relatively safe and reachable. He pointed out that he was probably one of the very few people that was actually visited by his parents in the war zone. Vietnam was a country, he said. You could fly in, fly out, and do business there. My parents actually had moved to Hong Kong, and they just flew into Saigon, and I met them for dinner. Therefore, the experience of 1971 around Saigon could not have been represented by the same novels as the jungle combats of 68 and 69. While the dream to meet with the combat hero did not ultimately come true, I learned that war novels try to capture a general experience, but they simply cannot elaborate on the thousands of eccentricities and multiple experiences. While as a war story fanatic, I often looked for the definite answer in war literature, I learned that the truth of war can only be discovered through the multiplicity of perspective. Last but not least, Mr. Frondorf's testimony challenged the literary tradition of homecoming and the portrayal of Vietnam veteran as a trauma hero. In his article, The Trauma Hero, Royce Scranton points out that there is a special myth embedded in war literature. Quote, every true war story, he claims, is a story of trauma and recovery. A boy goes to war, his head full of romantic visions of glory, courage, and sacrifice. His heart yearning to achieve heroic deeds, but on the field of the battle, he finds only death and horror. He sees, suffers, and causes brutal and brutalizing violence. Such violence wounds the soldier's very soul. After the war, the boy, now veteran, and the man returns to the world of peace, haunted by his experience, wrecked by the central compassion of trauma and atrocity. The struggle between the need to bear witness to his shattering encounter with violence and the compulsion to repress it. The truth of war, the veteran comes to learn, is a truth beyond words, a truth that can only be known by having been there, an unspeakable truth he must bear for society. Resulting from his unique experience in Vietnam, Mr. Frondorf shared a homecoming and reintegration story that was entirely different from the formerly described mainstream narrative. He pointed out that individuals can positively benefit from military experience. The military in general, he said, helped me with self-confidence, direction, and organization. Besides his self-improvement, Mr. Frondorf also had the exceptional opportunity to maintain a position of leadership at a young age. As a leader of 26 soldiers at the age of 23, he not only learned to direct himself, but also discovered how to lead others. He revealed that the military leadership is not only about rank, and that the skills of a good leader in the military are the same as in civilian life. He reminded me that besides trauma and disillusionment, the Vietnam War literary legacy should leave space for narratives of self-development. All in all, Mr. Frondorf's experience in 1971 revealed that time, space, rank, and pre-war zone experience can generate different war stories. Therefore, any war, but especially Vietnam, must be represented through the multiplicity of narratives. There is no true war story, but there's truth in every war story. And in order to get a holistic picture of Vietnam, the civilian reader must interact with multiple veterans, read multiple stories, and engage with the war on multiple levels. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Could you tell me again, what did he do? I know you said it at the beginning, but what was his career after he left the military?
He actually went to graduate school for architecture, and she still remained in the reserves for, I think, 30 years.
So it's interesting, it connected with your interest in architecture.
It is, yes. It's really funny. I was surprised by when I looked up his bio before the interview. I was really surprised by that. He also had this interesting point about she really liked being part of the reserves, pronouns, not an English speaker. So yes, he loved being part of the reserves because he felt that he could talk about something else than actually design and his industry. So that was really interesting. Yes?
A question that's a little bit more general than just your discussion. It seems to me that one of the things that's a curious thing to put your finger on is that when NROTC leaves here, it's cold turkey. That is to say, wasn't there some other kind of way for Dartmouth educational institutions across the country, because this happens all up and down the board, continue to have a relationship with the United States military? And is there now today a kind of recovering of some of those kinds of possibilities? I know, for example, a young person who's just graduated from the Coast Guard Academy came to Dartmouth for a training program. It had nothing to do with Dartmouth, but she's taken through the service up here to, I think, in the cold weather research area. So are there programs like that are now functioning that bring Dartmouth and the military together?
I can help. Yes. Yeah. Dartmouth, it's a shame to kind of leave it off at Vietnam in a way, because Dartmouth does come back and reestablish a relationship with the military, for sure. There's Army ROTC now on campus, a lot of veteran students in Tuck, and of course there's us in the undergraduate population. So there is a definite relationship going on today, for sure, on Dartmouth campus.
Yeah, I can speak to that too. So I'm in the women's basketball team, and actually one of our freshmen is in the Army ROTC, and she is supported by the ROTC program through funding her education. So it is an ongoing relationship. Yes?
May I add just a little bit to that as well? My name is Nate Fick, and there's another side of this as well, I think, sir, that's worth thinking about. I've been on the board here for 7 years, and I'm a Marine veteran, so I was very interested in the topic of trying to reestablish some of these ties. But you tend to see from the perspective of the educational institutions not welcoming the relationship with the military. DoD also is very cost conscious in establishing these relationships. So what we ran into, and talking with the Army and Navy was, they effectively said, hey, we get more bang for our buck putting a program at a big southern school than we do putting a program at Dartmouth. And so there are two parties here. And I think it's part of a broader trend maybe in the country with the military moving south, moving west, moving from urban to rural. There's no Coast Guard or no Air Force base on Cape Cod anymore. There's not a Navy base in Maine anymore, a big one. I mean, people, partly because you can't buy a house at the end of the runway and complain about the jet noise, right? So it's part of this broader trend of almost the great sort, the sifting in our society. And frankly, from my seat, I hold DoD to task on some of this as much as I would the schools.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think there's this kind of curious segregation that's going on that really disturbs me intellectually in terms of the separation. I'm actually from Omaha, Nebraska. Most of my career has been Offutt Air Force Base is there, so that we interact with military a lot. But I think areas like this, when I come back and put on my Dartmouth hat, it seems like it's a very distant reach.
I agree with that. And I think Dartmouth is just a part of a much broader societal trend in that regard.
Vitalia?
Yeah, that notion of DoD accountability I think is really important. I went to go speak with my vocational rehab counselor the other day, and she said it was more cost effective for them to have me transfer to Southern New Hampshire University. And so here I am having to advocate for myself, for the person who's supposed to advocate for me, and trying to convince me that, the institution that Dartmouth is and all of its benefits are probably not in my best interest. And so there's a really interesting conversation happening right now. But there's also the other side of veterans tend to be skeptical of the idea that institutions of higher education, particularly Ivy League institutions, are sincerely invested in them. Dartmouth has been really successful in increasing its veteran population, but prior to that they were working with Posse. And so through that program, having an initiative to recruit veterans to apply for and buy in to Dartmouth, they were just skeptical. They didn't think that an institution like Dartmouth would want them and that they would be able to go for free. I am here for free, and it is still mind-blowing. And so that DoD accountability is really important, because I think we need to start prioritizing education amongst veterans in the same vein that we need to hold these schools accountable for not making their educations always accessible. It goes both ways.
Yeah, I'd just like to throw in, so having attended Dartmouth and also Columbia as a veteran, and dealing a little bit with that, am I good enough to get in, do they want me? I would say if it wasn't for the work of Jim Wright, specifically here, actually walking the halls of Walter Reed and actually recruiting veterans to go here and being instrumental in the post 9/11 bill, it was really a game changer in helping Dartmouth change that perception in the Ivy League and drawing veterans into the program. And it's still a challenge. It's even today, you have to actively get out there and talk to the guys and girls that are separated and tell them, hey, you do stand a chance, you do belong there, you can add value to that community. But it's a larger challenge that we have to overcome in society.
This is a matter of interest. In 1970, the medical school, they opened a program, the MEDEX program. It was an effort to take corpsmen and medics from the military service and bring them to the medical school and train them to be physician's assistants. And that went on for 5 years. And I was in the second class, and there were quite an array of characters that were let loose on the campus. And, I won't tell you how interesting it was. It was quite an amazing time. But that effort, I've spoken to people here about it, and there seems to be no zeal to do that again. But I thought it was one of the greatest uses of talent and training, and it was also a saving grace for a lot of us. I'd been a teacher in special ed before I got drafted, and when I got out of the service, there were no jobs in teaching because everybody was seeking a deferment. So it was a saving grace for me.
So along the lines of Jim Wright being a very important catalyst, do you know who started this program in the medical school?
I know it wasn't Jim Wright, and I've spoken to Jim Wright about this, and he didn't seem to have any interest in pursuing it, but I had spoken to other people. I'm not sure it was Bella Strauss was a pulmonologist, and she was a primary mover in this, and then there were a number of people who were involved in the development of computerized telemedicine, who thought that having physician's assistants spread out through New England, and a lot of us were in the National Health Service, they figured that we could spread out through New England and make accessibility and availability of medical care a working thing. And it was a pretty exciting thing. I remember we were introduced to using computers, algorithms, and all sorts of fancy stuff for education. It was a remarkable effort. I don't think it's quite come to the fruition that people have projected or hoped for. It was one hell of an effort.
Well, I want to thank everyone, and I especially want to thank the undergraduate presenters. And we are going to take a 30-minute pause and then have our final panel with the alumni veterans at 4 o'clock. We'll reconvene. And again, and I want to say, if anyone knows Jerry Mitchell, send him a card. He's very dear to me, but I think he could use a card right now. I want to thank the undergraduates.